mean I'll see it.
You know how it is when everything just feels too quiet. It was President's Day, and honestly, there is nothing worse than being a teenager in a town where the only thing to do is hang out at a mall that happens to be closed for the holiday. There were 5 of us. Me, Tyler, Jax, Sarah, and Chloe. We were just driving around, bored out of our minds, when Jax mentioned that the service entrance behind the department store usually has a faulty latch. He'd worked there over the summer and knew the security guards were basically non-existent on holidays. We didn't think it was a big deal. We just wanted to walk around, maybe steal some Cinnabons if the kiosk was left open, and take some cool pictures for social media. The mall at night, when it's completely empty, has this weird energy. It's like a liminal space. Everything looks fake, like a movie set that everyone abandoned in a hurry. We managed to get in through the loading dock. The heavy metal door groaned a little, but once we were inside, the silence hit us like a physical weight. The only lights were the dim, bluish emergency bulbs and the glowing exit signs that cast long, red shadows across the linoleum. It smelled like floor wax and that stale, recycled air that only exists in shopping centers. We were laughing at first, our voices echoing off the glass storefronts. Tyler was being an idiot, posing with the mannequins in the window of a high-end clothing store. But the further we got toward the center of the mall, the more the atmosphere started to shift. It started with the temperature. Malls are usually kept at that perfect, neutral temperature, but as we crossed the main atrium, it got freezing. I could see my breath misting in front of my face. Sarah pointed it out first. She said it felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. Then, the music started. It wasn't the normal upbeat pop stuff they played during the day. It was distorted, a slow, dragging version of a song from decades ago. It was coming from the overhead speakers, but it sounded like it was being played underwater. We stopped laughing. Jax tried to play it off, saying it was probably just a glitch in the automated system, but you could tell he was spooked. We decided to head back, but Chloe realized she'd dropped her phone near the fountain in the center court. She and Jax went back to grab it while the rest of us waited by the darkened escalators. That was the last time I saw them as themselves. We waited for 10 minutes, then 15. The mall felt like it was stretching, the corridors looking longer than they should have. We started calling out for them, but our voices didn't echo anymore. It was like the walls were absorbing the sound. We headed back toward the fountain, but when we got there, the area was different. The water in the fountain wasn't clear anymore. It was thick and dark, smelling like old pennies and rot. Chloe's phone was sitting on the edge of the fountain, but the screen was shattered from the inside out, the glass bulging upward. Tyler picked it up, and his hands started to tremble. There was something else on the floor. A trail of something dark and wet leading toward the service corridors behind the food court. We followed it, mostly because we were too terrified to leave them behind. That's when we saw the first mannequin that wasn't a mannequin. In the window of a bridal shop, there was a figure standing perfectly still. It was wearing a white gown, but the lace was soaked in something dark. As we got closer, I realized the skin wasn't plastic. It was pale, grayish, and stretched too tight over the bone. It was Sarah who noticed the hair. It was Chloe's blonde hair, still attached to a piece of scalp that had been crudely stapled to the figure's head. The eyes had been removed and replaced with polished black stones. It wasn't moving, but you could feel the agony coming off it in waves. I felt my stomach flip. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was filled with sand. We heard a wet, dragging sound from the corridor behind us. We turned our flashlights toward the noise and saw Jax. Or what used to be Jax. He was pinned to the wall, but not with nails. His limbs had been woven into the metal gate of a shuttered store. His arms were elongated, the bones snapped and reset at impossible angles to match the diamond pattern of the fence. He was still breathing. Every time his chest moved, the metal wires would grate against his exposed ribs. His tongue had been removed, and he just stared at us with eyes that were wide and brimming with tears that looked like oil. There was someone else there. A figure in a janitor's uniform, but the proportions were all wrong. He was too tall, his arms reaching down past his knees, and his face was just a smooth expanse of skin with a single, vertical slit where a mouth should be. He was holding a heavy industrial stapler and a pair of long, rusted shears. He wasn't a ghost, he was something. Physical, something that belonged to the mall itself. We ran. I don't remember much of the next few minutes, just the sound of our shoes slamming against the tiles and the feeling of something cold brushing against the back of my neck. We didn't look back for Tyler. We heard the sound of the stapler, a heavy, mechanical thud, followed by a wet, choking sound that cut off abruptly. Sarah and I made it to the loading dock, throwing ourselves through the door and into the cold night air. We didn't stop until we reached my car. We drove straight to the police station, sobbing and screaming, trying to explain what we'd seen. But when the police went back an hour later, the mall was perfectly normal. The service door was locked. The fountain was filled with clear, chlorinated water. There was no blood, no mangled bodies, and no janitor. Jax and Chloe were just gone. The police treated it like a runaway case at first, but there were no records of them leaving the city. No bus tickets, no sightings on external traffic cameras. The mall management claimed their security footage from that night was corrupted by a power surge. But I know what I saw. I know the way the light hit those black stones in Chloe's eye sockets. The worst part isn't even the disappearance. It's what happened a few weeks later. I was walking past that same mall during business hours, trying to face my fear. I looked into the window of that bridal shop. The mannequin in the white dress was gone, replaced by a new display. But there was a small, subtle detail that made me freeze in the middle of the crowded walkway. On the floor of the display, tucked into a corner where most people wouldn't notice, was a single, silver earring. It was a small heart shape, exactly like the ones I gave Chloe for her birthday. I looked up at the new mannequin in the center of the display. It was a male figure, dressed in a sharp tuxedo. It looked incredibly realistic. Too realistic. As I stared at its face, I noticed a tiny, almost invisible line of silver staples running along the hairline. And for a split second, I could have sworn the eyes flickered, just a tiny movement of the pupils tracking me as I stood there. I don't go to malls anymore. I can't stand the smell of floor wax or the sound of soft, distorted music playing over the speakers. Because I know that when the doors lock and the lights go down, the janitor is still there, looking for new materials to fill the empty spaces in the windows. And I know that somewhere, deep in the service corridors where the cameras don't reach, my friends are still being put on display, one staple at a time.
Next story.
You know how it is on those federal holidays. The whole world just sort of goes into a coma. It's President's Day, so the banks are locked up, the schools are empty, and the post office is basically a ghost town. No mail trucks, no carriers walking the pavement, nothing. It's that specific kind of quiet where you can hear a car tire hitting a pebble 3 streets over. I usually love it because it's the one day I can sit on my porch with a coffee and actually hear myself think without the neighborhood kids screaming or the leaf blowers going off. But there's this one house at the end of the cul-de-sac, that big, peeling Victorian with the overgrown hedges, and it doesn't stay quiet. I've lived here for about 4 years now, and I noticed it during my first summer. Every time a federal holiday rolls around and the rest of the country stops receiving mail, a plain white van pulls up to that house. It isn't a USPS truck, and it definitely isn't Amazon or FedEx. It has no markings, no logo, nothing but a rusted bumper and windows tinted so dark they look like obsidian. It doesn't matter if it's raining or if there's a foot of snow on the ground, that van shows up at exactly the same time every single time. The guy who lives there, I call him the collector, though I don't even know his real name. He's one of those people who seems like he's made of nothing but gray. Gray skin, gray hair, gray clothes that look like they've been washed in ash. He never leaves the house. I've never seen him mow the lawn or take out the trash. The only time that front door ever opens is when that van idles at the curb. He doesn't go out to meet the driver either. The driver, a guy in a heavy canvas coat despite the heat, just walks a small, square box up to the porch, sets it down, and leaves. Yesterday was President's Day, and the air was heavy, like a storm was holding its breath. I was out there on my porch, just watching. I'd seen the delivery a dozen times before, but something about the atmosphere felt off. Maybe it was the way the crows were circling the Victorian, or the fact that the wind was blowing from that direction, carrying a scent that made the back of my throat itch. It wasn't the smell of trash or sewage. It was something sweeter, thicker, like fruit that had been left in a plastic bag in the sun for a week, mixed with the metallic tang of a butcher shop. The white van pulled up right on schedule. The driver got out, and I noticed he was wearing thick, yellow latex gloves. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He reached into the back and pulled out a box about the size of a toaster. It was wrapped in heavy brown paper, but as he walked toward the porch, I saw a dark, wet spot blooming at the bottom corner of the cardboard. It was a deep, brownish red, and it was spreading fast. The driver didn't look bothered. He set it down on the top step and practically jogged back to the van. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. As the van sped off, I saw the front door of the Victorian crack open. Just an inch. The collector was standing there, but he wasn't looking at the box. He was looking straight at me. His eyes were these pale, watery slits, and even from 50 yards away, I felt a cold spike go right through my chest. He didn't move for a long time. He just watched me watching him. Eventually, his hand reached out, a long, spindly thing with nails that looked like yellowed bone, and he dragged the box inside. The thing is, curiosity is a poison. Once it gets into your blood, you can't just turn it off. About an hour later, I saw something I'd never seen before. The collector came back out. He didn't see me because I'd moved behind the mesh of my screen door. He was carrying a black trash bag, and he walked it down to the very edge of his property where the hedges meet the sidewalk. He dropped it there, tucked away under the leaves, and retreated back into the house. I waited. I told myself to stay inside, to mind my own business, to just go back to my coffee. But that smell was getting stronger. It was wafting across the street now, a heavy, cloying stench of rot that seemed to coat the inside of my lungs. I walked down my driveway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every step felt like I was moving through knee-deep water. When I got to the edge of his property, I could hear flies buzzing inside the bag. Not just a few, but a swarm, a frantic, rhythmic hum that sounded like a machine. I reached down, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grip the plastic. I told myself it was just old meat, that maybe the guy just had some weird ritual with his groceries. I pulled the top of the bag open, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from retching right there on the sidewalk. Inside the bag, sitting on top of a pile of blood-soaked paper towels, was a human foot. It wasn't a clean cut. It looked like it had been hacked. Off at the ankle with something dull, the bone jagged and white where it protruded from the shredded, graying meat. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the toenails had been painted a bright, cherry pink. It looked so ordinary, so domestic, which made the gore of it 1,000 times worse. There were deep, purple bruises around the arch of the foot, as if someone had gripped it too hard while it was still attached to a living body. I backed away, my boots slipping on the grass. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing, trying to find some logic, some reason why a man would get a human foot delivered to his house on a holiday when the rest of the world was resting. And then I remembered the boxes from the previous months. The smaller one on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The long, narrow one on New Year's. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a collection. I looked up at the house, and I saw him. The collector was standing at the second-story window now, the curtain pulled back just enough for me to see his face. He wasn't angry. He was smiling. It was a slow, wet grin that showed off teeth the color of old piano keys. He raised a hand, the same skeletal hand I'd seen earlier, and he pointed at me. Then he slowly moved his finger to his lips in a gesture of silence. I didn't call the police. I know how that sounds, but you have to understand the look in those eyes. It wasn't just "I'm going to kill you" eyes. It was "I know where you sleep, and I have plenty of boxes left to fill" eyes. I went back to my house and locked every single door. I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom door and sat there in the dark, listening to the silence of the holiday. The worst part isn't even the foot. It's the realization that Memorial Day is coming up in May. Then the 4th of July. Then Labor Day. There are so many holidays, so many days where the post office closes and the white van makes its rounds. I keep thinking about those pink toenails. They were so clean, so well maintained. Someone is missing that foot. Someone is probably lying in a basement somewhere, waiting for the next holiday to lose another piece of themselves. And now, every time I hear a car door slam or a tire roll over a pebble, I freeze. I find myself looking at my own hands, my own feet, wondering how they'd look wrapped in brown paper and sitting on a porch. I can still smell it, you know? That sickly, sweet rot. It's in my clothes. It's in my hair. I don't think I'll ever be able to get it out. Whatever you do, if you live in a quiet neighborhood and the mail stops running for a day, stay inside. Don't look at the vans. Don't look at the neighbors. And for the love of God, don't look in the bags. Some things aren't meant to be delivered, and some people are just waiting for a reason to add you to their special delivery.
Next story.
I never thought much about President's Day. To most of us, it was just a Monday off, a chance to sleep in or catch up on chores before the week really started. But in my neighborhood, that specific Monday changed everything. I'm telling you this because people need to know that the monsters aren't hiding in the woods or under the floorboards. They're the people you wave to while you're getting your mail. They're the ones who borrow your lawnmower and complain about the local school board. It started around noon. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, when the neighborhood group chat started blowing up. Usually, it's just people complaining about unpicked up dog waste or asking for recommendations for a plumber. But today, the messages were different. They were cold. Someone had posted a list of names and addresses. My neighbor from 3 doors down, Greg, had written a single sentence at the top of the thread, "Today is for the cleansing." I thought it was a sick joke at first. Greg was a quiet guy, a high school history teacher who spent his weekends meticulously trimming his hedges. But then I looked out the window. A group of men were standing in the middle of the street. They weren't wearing masks. They didn't need them. They were wearing their Sunday best, suits, iron shirts, looking like they were headed to a formal brunch. But they were carrying things that didn't match the clothes. Greg had a heavy, rusted pipe wrench, and the guy next to him, a real estate agent named Marcus, was holding a high-end kitchen cleaver. They didn't look angry. That was the scariest part. They looked determined, like they were finally getting around to a chore they had put off for years. They walked straight to the house across the street. It belonged to an elderly couple, the Millers. Mr. Miller had a habit of letting his trash cans blow over into the street, and apparently that was a debt that had finally come due. I watched through the slats of my blinds, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it was going to bruise. They didn't even knock. Marcus used the cleaver to hack at the wooden frame of the front door until the lock gave way. They disappeared inside. For a few seconds, the street was silent. Then came the screaming. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies. It was wet and desperate, the sound of someone realizing their life was being ended by their own neighbors. When they came back out 10 minutes later, Greg's white dress shirt was ruined. It was soaked through with a deep, dark crimson that looked almost black under the bright afternoon sun. He took a handkerchief out of his pocket and calmly wiped a spray of blood off his glasses. They looked at the list again, checked off a name, and started walking toward my side of the street. I scrambled away from the window, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. I didn't have a gun. I didn't even have a good baseball bat. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, but my hands were sweating so much I nearly dropped it. I realized then that they weren't just killing people they disliked, they were purging the neighborhood of anyone they deemed a nuisance, a burden, or just an eyesore. I heard the heavy thud of boots on my porch. My stomach turned over. I didn't have any major beef with anyone, but I had forgotten to mow my back lawn for 3 weeks. Was that enough? In their eyes, was a messy yard a capital offense? The front door groaned as they kicked it. I didn't wait. I bolted for the basement. It was a crawl space, mostly damp and smelling of mildew. I squeezed myself behind the furnace, pulling a dusty tarp over my body. I laid there, pressing my face into the cold concrete, trying to make my heartbeat go silent. Above me, the floorboards creaked. I could hear their voices. They weren't shouting. They were talking about the weather. The humidity is really going to be an issue for the cleanup, I heard Marcus say. His voice was right above my head. We should probably start the fires before sundown. It'll be easier to manage the remains. Agreed, Greg replied. I heard the sound of a kitchen chair being dragged across the floor. Did you see the state of his sink? Truly disgusting. Some people have no self-respect. It's a mercy, really. Bringing the property value back up for the rest of us. They wandered through the house, opening closets, smashing a few plates. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Every time the floorboards groaned, I felt a fresh surge of bile in the back of my throat. I kept imagining that cleaver slicing through the tarp, finding the soft meat of my neck. I thought about the Millers. Mrs. Miller used to bring me lemon bars every Christmas. Now she was probably just a collection of stains on her own living room carpet. Suddenly, the house went quiet. I didn't move. I stayed under that tarp for what felt like half a day. My limbs went numb, then started to ache with a dull, throbbing fire. Eventually, the smell reached me. It was the smell of wood smoke, but it was heavy and sweet, like a barbecue gone wrong. I knew what they were burning. When I finally gathered the courage to creep out of the basement, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows across the walls. I peeked out the back window. The entire cul-de-sac was glowing. They had built a massive bonfire in the middle of the park at the end of the block. They were standing around it, holding beers, chatting and laughing. I saw the silhouettes of bodies being tossed into the flames. They weren't even trying to hide it. They were proud. This was their holiday. I knew I couldn't stay. If they finished with their list and realized I was still breathing, they'd come back to finish the job. I grabbed a jacket and my car keys, moving like a ghost through my own home. I went out the back door, staying low in the tall grass of the yard I had neglected. I reached my car in the driveway and fumbled with the keys. Just as the engine turned over, the porch light of the house next door flickered on. It was Sarah. She was a nurse, a woman I'd shared a dozen friendly conversations with over the fence. She was standing there with a garden sprayer, the kind you use for pesticides. But the tank was filled with something clear and smelling of gasoline. She looked at me. Our eyes locked for a second. I expected her to scream or call out to the others. Instead, she just gave me a small, pitying smile and waved a gloved hand. "Happy President's Day," she mouthed. I floored it. I didn't stop until I was 3 towns over, but the smell of that smoke stayed in my clothes. It stayed in my hair. Even now, weeks later, I can't get it out. The police didn't do anything. By the time they arrived, the fires were out, the streets were swept, and everyone was back to their normal routines. There were no bodies left to find, and no one was talking. The worst part isn't the fear that they'll come for me again. The worst part is knowing that next year, they'll probably have a longer list. And when I look at my new neighbors in this new town, I find myself looking at their hands. I find myself wondering what kind of tools they keep in their garages, and if they're just waiting for the next holiday to use them on me. I still haven't unpacked my boxes. I don't think I ever will. Every time I hear a knock on the door or the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower, I freeze. I check the group chats. I watch the lists. Because I know now that civility is just a thin, fragile skin, and some people are just waiting for an excuse to peel it off and show you what's underneath. I thought moving 2 towns over would be enough to scrub the memory of that Monday from my mind. I found a small, nondescript rental at the end of a cul-de-sac, the kind of place where the houses all look like they were built from the same set of gray and beige blocks. It felt safe. It felt anonymous. I spent the first few weeks living like a ghost, keeping my lights low and my car tucked deep into the garage. I didn't want to be noticed. I didn't want to be a neighbor anymore. But as the next long weekend approached, the one for Memorial Day, the atmosphere in this new neighborhood started to shift in a way that felt sickeningly familiar. It began with a gift on my porch. No card, no name, just a wicker basket filled with local jam, a small American flag, and a printed newsletter for the neighborhood association. I picked it up with a pair of kitchen tongs, my heart already doing that frantic, fluttering thing against my ribs. I sat at my kitchen table and scanned the pages. It was mostly boring stuff, reminders about pool safety and a recipe for potato salad. But on the very last page, there was a section titled The Commemoration Honor Roll. There were 3 names on that list. My name was the first one. I stared at the letters until they blurred into black smudges. Below the names, there was a short paragraph written in a cheerful, bubbly font. It said, "We remember those who have served, and we honor our community by removing the weeds that choke our garden. Join us at sunset for the seasonal pruning." I didn't pack a bag. I didn't even grab my phone charger. I just headed for the garage, desperate to get to my car and drive until I hit the coast. But when I hit the button for the garage door, nothing happened. I pressed it again, harder, the plastic casing cracking under my thumb. Nothing. I looked up at the tracks and saw that someone had padlocked the heavy metal door from the outside. They weren't even hiding it this time. They knew I knew. I backed into the kitchen, my breath coming in hot, ragged bursts. The sunlight was starting to fade, the sky turning that bruised, purple color that precedes a storm. I looked out the small window above the sink. My neighbor to the left, a woman, named Mrs. Gable, who looked about 80 years old, was standing in her driveway. She was wearing a floral apron and holding a pair of heavy-duty lopping shears, the kind you use to cut through thick tree branches. She wasn't gardening. She was just standing there, looking at my house, slowly opening and closing the blades. Snip. 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 Then the power went out. The silence that followed was heavy, thick like wet wool. I stood in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamps that had just flickered on outside. I heard a soft, rhythmic thudding against the side of the house. It sounded like someone was tossing a tennis ball against the siding over and over. I crept toward the living room and peeked through the blinds. A group of them were gathered on my lawn. There must have been 10, maybe 15 people. They were all dressed in white. Not suits this time, but white coveralls, the kind painters wear. They looked like a collection of ghosts standing under the flickering orange glow of the street lamp. Marcus was there. I recognized the real estate agent from my old neighborhood, the one with the kitchen cleaver. He must have followed me. Or maybe this wasn't just a neighborhood thing. Maybe it was a network. "We know you're in there," Marcus called out. His voice was pleasant, almost melodic. "There's no need to make this difficult. You saw the list. You're a transplant. An invasive species. You don't belong in the soil here." I backed away from the window, tripping over a footstool. I scrambled into the hallway, my hands searching the walls for some kind of weapon. I ended up in the bathroom, locking the door and sliding into the empty bathtub. It felt like a casket. I clutched a heavy glass candle jar I'd grabbed from the counter, a pathetic defense against 15 people with power tools. I heard the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. Then the front door was kicked in. They didn't rush. They moved through the house with a terrifying, coordinated patience. I could hear them opening doors, moving furniture, checking closets. They were talking to each other as they worked, chatting about the best way to get blood out of grout and which local charity they should donate my furniture to once the cleaning was done. "He's in the back," a woman's voice said. It sounded like Mrs. Gable. I saw the light from his candle jar through the bathroom window. He's cornered himself. I heard their footsteps in the hallway. I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. The doorknob turned. It held for a second, then there was a sharp, splintering crack. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a dull thud. The beam of a high-powered flashlight hit me square in the face, blinding me. I threw the candle jar, but it just thudded harmlessly against someone's chest. A pair of strong hands reached over the edge of the tap and hauled me out. I fought, I kicked, I tried to bite, but there were too many of them. They dragged me into the living room and forced me down onto the coffee table. Marcus was standing there, his white coveralls pristine. He leaned in close, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint. "You're a runner," he whispered. "We don't like runners. It suggests you don't appreciate the sacrifice. It suggests you think you're better than the community." He reached into a leather tool roll on the table and pulled out a long, thin needle, the kind used for upholstery. He didn't use it on my throat. He grabbed my left hand and driven it straight through my palm, pinning it to the wooden surface of the table. The pain was white-hot, a searing, electric jolt that made my vision go black at the edges. I tried to scream, but Marcus slammed a heavy, grease-stained rag over my mouth. "No, no," he chided. "Memorial Day is for reflection. For quiet." I watched, paralyzed by shock and pain, as the others gathered around. Mrs. Gable approached with her shears. She looked at my hand, then at my face, and gave me a little wink. "The tendons are the hardest part," she said, her voice conversational and light. "They're like thick rubber bands. You really have to put your weight into the handles to get a clean snip." She reached for my leg. I felt the cold metal of the blades slide against my ankle. I looked toward the window, praying for a siren, a headlight, anything. But the street was silent. Every house on the block had their lights off. Every neighbor was either in my living room or tucked safely in their beds, waiting for the weeds to be cleared. The first cut was deep. I felt the skin part, a hot, wet sensation that was followed by a sickening crunch as the blades hit bone. I couldn't even scream anymore. My body just went into a state of violent, rhythmic tremors. I watched my own blood spray across Marcus's white sleeve, a brilliant, vibrant red that looked beautiful and horrifying against the fabric. "Look at that," Marcus said, pointing at the stain. "That's the life of the community. That's the red in the flag. They didn't kill me quickly. That wasn't the point. They took their time, commemorating different parts of me, discussing which of my flaws warranted which injury. My lack of participation in the neighborhood watch that cost me a finger. My failure to introduce myself to the mailman that was a long, shallow slice down my ribs. By the time the sun started to peek over the horizon, I was barely a person anymore. I was just a collection of open wounds and broken bones, pinned to my own furniture. They started to pack up their tools, wiping them clean with the same methodical care they used for their kitchen counters. "We'll leave the rest for the morning crew," Marcus said, patting me on the shoulder. He looked tired but satisfied, like a man who had just finished a long shift at the office. "They'll handle the disposal and the deep clean. You did well. You've contributed more to this neighborhood in one night than most people do in a lifetime." They walked out the front door, chatting about where they should go for breakfast. I could hear their laughter echoing down the street as they dispersed to their own homes, their own lives. I'm lying here now, watching the dust motes dance in the morning light. The blood has stopped flowing. It's turned into a thick, tacky crust that binds me to the table. I can hear the sound of a lawnmower starting up next door. I can hear a dog barking. The world is moving on. I can see a van pulling into my driveway now. It's white, with a logo on the side that says "Community Cleaners, we make your neighborhood shine." 2 men are getting out. They're wearing white coveralls. They're carrying heavy-duty trash bags and a gallon of bleach. They're whistling a patriotic tune. I hope you never find your name on a list. I hope you never move to a neighborhood that cares too much about its garden. Because once they decide you're a weed, there's no place left to grow.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.